Imagine this: a camp full of soldiers, meat roasting over every fire, more food than they've seen in weeks, and men are dying anyway, not from battle, not from an empty stomach, but while eating every single day. That's not a metaphor. It happened, more than once, in places and centuries that had never heard of each other. It starts in the winter of 150 BC, in the hill country of Roman Spain. The historian Appian recorded that the legions had run short of wine, salt, oil, and vinegar, and were reduced to living on wheat, barley, and large quantities of venison and rabbit, boiled without seasoning. There was meat every day, and yet, Appian writes, dysentery spread through the camp, and many men died. We can't know with certainty, 2,000 years later, exactly what killed them. But their diet, meat in abundance, almost nothing else, matches a pattern modern physiology would take centuries to explain. It happened again. Centuries later, fur trappers working the Canadian wilderness for the Hudson's Bay Company sometimes lived almost entirely on rabbit, abundant, easy to snare, seemingly reliable. Company records describe men dying of what looks unmistakably like starvation, despite eating rabbit daily, often in large quantities. French-Canadian trapper called it mal de caribou. Indigenous hunters across the north had recognized the pattern long before that, and steered around it instinctively, feeding the leanest meat to their dogs rather than to themselves. It eventually acquired a clinical name, protein poisoning. But the folk name has stuck, because it captures something the science hasn't quite managed to: a man surrounded by food and dying regardless. Here's the strange part. The problem isn't simply protein. It's what happens when protein becomes almost the only fuel available. Protein can keep you alive, but when nearly all your calories come from lean protein, your body runs into a problem. Protein is a poor substitute for fat. Breaking it down creates nitrogen waste, which the liver and kidneys have to process and remove. Push that system far enough, for long enough, and the body begins to struggle. Nausea first, then digestive collapse, then an exhaustion no amount of eating seems to touch. Researchers studying diets across more than 200 traditional hunting societies found something telling. No matter how meat-heavy the culture, protein rarely climbed much past roughly a third to two-fifths of total calories. Some researchers argue the body simply can't safely run on much more than that for long, though exactly where that line sits remains debated. What's clear is that lean meat, eaten alone, pushes uncomfortably close to it. One man found this out the hard way, in his own body, and it would change how an entire diet was understood. In the early 20th century, a young explorer named Vilhjalmur Stefansson was living among the copper Inuit, learning to survive on a diet that was, by any conventional standard, almost inconceivable. Fish, seal, caribou, whale, virtually no plant food at all. And for years, he was healthy on it. Until one season, hunting animals that had come through a lean winter, he and his companions ate caribou so thin there was barely any fat left behind the eyes or in the marrow. Within days, Stefansson was seriously ill. The same kind of meat that had sustained him for years, when it became extremely lean, had nearly broken him. He recovered only once fat was reintroduced. The danger, he came to believe, wasn't meat itself. It was meat when almost all the fat had been stripped away. In 1928, Stefansson set out to test that conviction somewhere no folk story could dismiss: a hospital ward in Manhattan. Together with fellow explorer Karsten Anderson, he checked into Bellevue Hospital under the supervision of Dr. Eugene Dubois, submitting to blood tests and constant observation for over a year, eating nothing but meat, fat, and water. Physicians predicted scurvy, newspapers treated it as a stunt, but this time the two men weren't surviving on stripped-down rations. They ate steak, roast beef, brain, tongue, organ meats, fatty cuts, often rare, chosen deliberately to mirror what Arctic hunters had always favored over lean muscle. When the results were published in 1930, they showed something the doctors hadn't expected. No scurvy, no kidney damage, no collapse. The experiment didn't prove a meat and fat diet could sustain a person forever. A year is a year, not a lifetime, but under rigorous medical observation, it sustained 2 men for well over 12 months without the catastrophic breakdown everyone had confidently predicted. The difference between the diet that broke the Roman legions and the diet that carried Stefansson through Bellevue wasn't the presence of meat. It was one variable hiding inside the meat itself: fat. That single variable raises a harder question. How much meat can a human being actually live on? For our closest ancient relatives, the answer once seemed obvious: chemical signatures in Neanderthal bones. Nitrogen ratios matching wolves and hyenas long suggested they hunted large herbivores almost exclusively. More recent isotope studies complicate that picture, suggesting plant matter may have made up a meaningful share of their diet after all. Some researchers have even proposed that part of that unusually high nitrogen signature might come from something else entirely: decomposing meat and the maggots inside it. The chemistry once thought to settle the question is itself still being investigated. Not every meat-heavy diet in history followed the Roman legion's path. Traditional Inuit populations weren't just avoiding rabbit starvation. Some evidence suggests they were quietly benefiting from something researchers only identified decades later: the fat in their diet, drawn from wild seals and whales rather than farmed animals, turned out to be unusually rich in omega-3 fatty acids. One study in northern Quebec found that adults still eating largely traditional diets had roughly half the cardiac death rate of other North Americans. The same broad category of eating could apparently produce radically different outcomes, depending on the type of fat, the amount of protein, and the rest of the diet and lifestyle surrounding it. Which brings the story back to those Roman soldiers, boiling their unsalted rabbit and venison in the hills of Spain, never knowing why the food in front of them wasn't keeping them alive. The lesson wasn't that meat was dangerous. The lesson was that meat had limits. Lean meat could fill a stomach without meeting the body's actual needs, and sometimes the difference between food that sustains a person and food that slowly destroys them isn't how much they have. It's what isn't there. A full stomach, it turns out, was never the same thing as a nourished body.